Hey everybody. I think I will achieve, and is my attempt to fail to reach the intellectual heights that we've seen so far today, to talk about some really concrete and mundane dimensions of text. As Fabian said, like the past is boring, but there are some critical aspects of what text is today that we should talk about as we're imagining a future and thinking about what opportunities we have, not just the opportunity, but the obligation to kind of reevaluate and revise. So I'm going to talk about what this is not. I do have a job in this kind of technical sphere, and I'm not talking about that. And then what I am going to be talking about, some of the historical turning points and the basic takeaways for that. So it's I should look at how I'm doing time. So first of all, what this is not a sketch of any prototypes. I have some of them out there. I've been happy to talk to folks about things that I've done off my own bat, as well as anything in an official capacity. This is not that. So that out of the way. Text has been with us, as we've heard, for a very, very long time. We have extant records going back around 5,000 years, and that's awesome. It's also easy to then conclude that text has largely been the same thing over that period of time, which is absolutely not the case. If you look at those cuneiform tablets, they are mundane records of disputes over copper sales and things like that. But those are also really important. They're things that involve a lot of money, power, capital, whatever you want to call it. And so it's likely pretty unimaginable that even though we could write that same email today, we could have those same kind of complaints and disputes, pull them in front of ombudsman. The other things that we do with text would have been just as science fiction and unimaginable as the possibility of a flying car, if and when that ever happens either. So there are a lot of things that we can kind of lull ourselves into a false sense of continuity with, that we need to go back and grapple with in order to understand some of the opportunities that actually lie ahead for us in terms of what text can be as a consequence, one, of the technical substrate that we have, incredible sort of capabilities, not just of virtual reality, although that's certainly a part, but generally dynamic media as it exists today. But also the cognitive and perceptual science that undergirds our ability to design things of any sort of kind for any purpose these days. We know so much more about the mind, we know so much more about the body, that even without those technical developments as they've existed and are incredibly convenient, we should be able to come up with a better text. And so with those two things in mind, it's worth taking a little bit of a retrospective in order to think about what we've left on the table, what kinds of opportunities may lie ahead for us. And the point is that every one of these little choices, every one of these little bits and pieces, like I said, cuneiform, was text, is not what we communicate with today. There aren't one or two kind of developments. It's not just that movable type is important. It obviously is. But there are other things like page numbers, which came out long after movable type, that were just as transformative. And we continue accreting these things, and they're amazing. They're very exciting. So some of these historical turning points. The monumental to the mundane is a transition that we've had where when literacy was rock bottom, very low, it's not that it was useless. Obviously, somebody felt it, fit to complain about the copper sale and things like that. And the monumental text as it exists in ancient Egypt also plays a significant effect in terms of being able to act as a projection of power. But writing is a communication tool. Communication always is subject to network effects. The fact that the more people you can talk to, the more valuable talking is, the more you can communicate in these ways. And so when literacy was lower overall, there were specialized sort of capabilities, people who were sort of experts in listening and reading and speaking and things like that. Those people had a special position, but overall in a societal context, it was less impactful than when we all can do it, albeit to varying degrees. That said, there was a belief in a literal magic to text. There were incredible sort of shock and awe aspects to what textuality was, what media creation was, that we lose once it becomes mundane enough that everybody can do it. Now people can make YouTube videos, or they can make videos, and we're sort of collectively recovering from that. The idea that when you make something that looks like a newspaper, you must be a newspaper is something that we're still struggling with. But another aspect of having these professional readers, professional writers, like literally just reading and writing, beyond even things like journalism, is that whenever a person is involved in the process, then they imbue it with enough intentionality to be able to enrich it. So when people were just scribes, when they were just encoding things, they were still manipulating and interpreting things in a way that when you intervene with a digital system or some kind of purely mechanical system, you don't have that level of insight and input. So a lot of people say that they were like a husband and wife team will write a book, and the wife will have just typed it up, and she did not just type it up. She was at least as much a part of it in a number of those cases, and it's only when it turns out that the woman was the more important part of it that people believe that it ends up to have been an equal partnership. So another important part about this, one other development, is that there's been an overall over like 99.9% drop in the cost of books prior to the printing press to today. Like, they used to cost more than a townhouse, and as somebody who bought a house actually literally yesterday, that is terrifying to me. It was a lot of money. And so what it was that books were for and what people felt like they would do with it were manifestly different. The kind of flippancy that we can kind of treat text and information with is really amazing and exciting. But that also, and it also broadens the scope of who is able to contribute in that way. That said, it awakens that as a signal for overall importance. Michael mentioned that when we encode something in a book in a certain way, then that's a signal of intent to future generations. That signal is, by definition, becoming weaker as a consequence of the ubiquity of these things. That's elitist at some level, but it is also true. Like, because more people can do it, we don't know as much about what it means when it happens. And then typing. This is a really big one for me. I have a terrible hand. Like, when I write with it, it's fine. But typing rapidly increases the speed of text input, and it also universalizes the legibility of it. But that said, it means that you have a much more limited capacity for generating something like a palimpsest or sort of glossed notes, where you have the ability to kind of conceive of a document as being sort of arbitrarily orientable and to lose the dimensionality of how people write and whether there are different inks and things like that. So while it's great and it's been incredible for the consistency of text, it's also been pretty deleterious for some of the dimensionality of what we get out of text when we see it. It also increases the upfront cost of writing, at least in the short term, when people have to have typewriters instead of ink pens and things like that. And then my most recent thing I'm going to reach to is 1959, xerography and then copy and paste. That once we got photocopying and Gestetner machines, other things that you use for being able to make duplicates existed before that, but photocopying really allowed you to make a literal exact copy of a document without having to retype it. It's hard to grasp just how much people had to produce and reproduce the same document over and over and over again. And there were actually cognitive benefits to that as well. There are ideas of commonplace books and Zibaldone, these ideas that people would take to heart things that they really liked, and they would write them down, and they would read from them. One of the reasons why Oxford University used to accept people as young as like 12 years old is because they would actually have to go through a literacy program where they would write out their own textbooks. They would copy their entire documents in order to be able to do that. And I've done that a couple of times, mostly with artwork rather than with textual documents. But there's an incredible impact of actually writing those things out, and the kind of cumulative impact of being able to kind of read those words, not because you came up with it, but because you wrote them yourself. So while xerography, copy-paste, all of these things are incredible, they do mean that we lose some aspects of the human animal's capacity for kind of understanding through repetition and other things like that. So, yeah, that's all I have in terms of the sort of the historical side. But the point of it is that progress is not an inevitability. These things didn't have to happen in this order. They're also not an objective good. Like overall, I think that the way that we have text today is very exciting, very interesting. But there are a number of sort of avenues and alleys that we've gone down in terms of what specifically text constitutes that we have an opportunity to really reappraise and try to reimagine based on what we can do today. And there's not necessarily going to be one solution to it, but to understand that there are a range of cognitive and social effects that we can glean from constructing text in these different ways, and that the socio-technical environment that we find ourselves in today has never been better to be able to ask those questions and kind of evaluate the results. So yeah, so the progress isn't inevitable. It's not an objective good. There are things that we've lost along the way. But it is under our control. We have the ability to play with these handles, these dimensions, and I think it obliges us to be able to explore them. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, 3 minutes for questions. Mark, can you set up, please? Thank you. Questions, comments, discussions, arguments?
Yeah.
Yeah, I went to a math conference where they were talking around notations and how there was like new letters that were being developed that were more spatial, but they couldn't print it because of the constraints of movable type. So I'm wondering, now that we have XR, have the spatial dimension, but also with like even emojis seems to be an extension of even more graphical representations. But now that we have 3 dimensions of space, we're not constrained by that same type of movable type constraints. I'm wondering what you think of might be the expansion of that with the constraints of input still being a consideration, and like if you imagine the extension of languages or moving into more things like emoji or things that even evolve over time, like animations, animated GIFs, things like that.
Yeah, emojis are interesting because they're presented in a certain way, but then they're encoded in a completely different way. And there's a certain amount of disparity with regard to the visual ambiguity of them. You have sort of laughing, crying emoji versus the Unicode equivalent of it, things like that. And you know, we for the longest time sort of reached not a collision, but like a confluence of the sort of encodable representation of those things versus what they sort of appear as. And I'm curious about how people expect to resolve that. Obviously, in things like HTML, we have HTML entities and the ability to encode those things in UTF-8. They, at least initially, are either sort of encoded trivially within documents or recoverable with enough fidelity of that representation. You know, if people take a screenshot of an emoji, then good luck trying to figure out which one it is. I'm also conscious, though, that to the point in the Folger library, like we had dust bunnies there. I want digital dust bunnies, and I think that we're missing a whole dimension of what it has been to construct and compose and manipulate and work with this text. That I think that we're maybe, frankly, decades, if only, or maybe just years from being able to kind of recompose and understand that use and manipulation, sharing are at least as important as the sort of the nominal document itself. So that's something that I'm concerned with, and I hope people have the ability to store more and play with it.